The first thing I saw were the walls of the living room. Two people were sitting and drinking wine, a woman and a man. There was a place for a woman here, but not for a man. The man who belonged here was absent. This man was larger, rougher. His voice was low and full of a web of seduction, the spell unwinding in the silent wariness of the living room. The woman looked modest, hiding her duplicity behind ostentatious modesty. Their conversation was full of innuendos, skillfully played out by both sides. There was something vaguely humorous about it, reminiscent of the conversation of high school romantics, carried on furtively around a corner where the teachers could not observe, or like an 18th century farce in which sly wit and jaded sophistication laughed together as they plunged their rapiers into the breast of an innocent honesty and true love. Their first kiss was timid, short, and not fully passionate. The next one turned into a full-on tongue-wrestling match. He pulled her into his arms, while the mantelpiece frowned at this secret scene. Outside, the wind blew, a sudden gust, and the house groaned. The old logs, long since settled, began to shake, and the floor above creaked alarmingly. The two lovers' gazes turned upward. He became worried. "Is anyone home?" "No," was her timid answer. "John is in France, you know that. This old house just creaks sometimes. I'd swear the house was haunted if I believed in such things." He shrugged. "It's a wonderful old place. How did you get it?" "John inherited it from his great-aunt. It really is worth millions. The grounds are gorgeous and have recently been refurbished. Forget it. You were telling me something." He pulled her into his arms again and whispered in her ear. His words were too quiet to be heard, even in the silence of the house. Everything was quiet. Tension was in the air. The fire in the fireplace crackled, using up its allotted fuel, spitting out sparks from time to time. The woman giggled, and they kissed again. The blind Cupid on the last baluster was silent in disapproval as he watched the man unzip her dress. Cupid's usually angelic face seemed to frown menacingly in the firelight. Large hands slid inside, caressing the satiny skin. It became apparent that she was not wearing a bra. As the cute little dress she was wearing, the dress her husband had bought her for her birthday, but which she had never worn, had slipped down to her waist. The naked breasts were impressive, not so much in size as in shape, firmness, and high position. They seemed larger as they moved forward. "Fire has invaded." A small drop of oil, which had been in the wood for a long time, burst, causing a small explosion, causing the guilty couple to flinch. This was quickly forgotten as his thumb stroked the small nub, drawing a moan from her lips. The eyes of the moose head mounted above the fireplace glared angrily at the intruder. The man paused his relentless seduction for a moment, as if sensing their gaze, then quickly focused on his prey. He worked on this conquest for several months. The fruits of his labor were before his eyes. The gorgeous young wife of his boss, John Hayward, was finally standing topless before him. He was going to have fun with her tonight on the family bed. Neglect, ignored merit, refusal of promotion will finally be rewarded with the body of this beautiful stranger's wife. He deepened their kiss, slowly leaning her back until her head was on the pillow and she was lying supine beneath him. The springs of the antique sofa protested against such a load, but the couple did not pay attention to it. The man's lips drew a fiery line down the white neck of the beautiful young wife, causing a shiver in her fragile body. The sensations overwhelmed her. She moaned softly, her fingers tangling in his hair to bring his teasing lips closer. She gasped as his lips found her sensitive spots again, the sound not going unnoticed by the eavesdropping walls, their strength apparently unbroken by the actions of the couple who were now squirming on the couch. Her lover caressed her breasts, giving them all his attention. The young wife's mind, now consumed by the sensation she was experiencing, could hardly contain her excitement. The all-consuming fire left the heaving breasts and scattered sparks across the flat stomach, pausing to plunge a dagger of pleasure into the tiny navel. The lover tickled that delicious curve for a moment before moving down to the dress, now gathered into a knot at the waist. Her fingers pulled and she lifted her hips, letting the dress slide down. The dress was thrown off. There was another gust of wind. The stairs creaked in protest at the scene in the living room. The protest went unnoticed by the couple, writhing in passion on the sofa. Kisses showered the smooth, silky skin, and the young wife's moans became more audible. Sounds of passion were heard. All the necessary, skillful movements were made. His skillful play brought her close to the edge, to the opening abyss of pleasure, but he wanted more. "Let's get comfortable. Where's your bedroom?" he whispered. "Upstairs," she moaned. He wrapped the slender body in his strong embrace, and the walls shook from another gust of wind. He carried her easily towards the stairs. She trembled from the strength of the arms that held her so easily. He rejoiced in anticipation of his inevitable triumph. The steps creaked in protest as he stepped on them with his bare feet. His ankle twisted slightly due to a fold in the ancient rug. He straightened up and continued up the darkening stairs. Above him, the 13th step of an ancient staircase, dry and warped over the years, gave a little, and one of the old nails, freed from its bonds, turned out, exposing its sharp tip. The man carried his prize upstairs, and the house held its breath in anticipation. Another gust of wind caused a symphony of creaks and groans from ancient beams. The man's bare foot landed on the 13th step, and he screamed as sparks flashed in his eyes and a pinprick of pain pierced his heel. He staggered, trying to regain his balance as the symphony of creaking wood rose to a crescendo. Then, with a hoarse cry, he tumbled down the stairs, clutching his burden, barely aware of the danger looming over them. He fell backwards, hitting his head on the edge of the step, and darkness swallowed him. She cried out too as they slid together towards their fate, their slide becoming a somersault, flesh and bone giving way to the skeletal hardness of old wood. He remained at the foot of the stairs, the awkward tilt of his head indicating that there was no hope of his survival. His companion hit the last baluster with a terrible crash, breaking her arm and several ribs, splitting this venerable column. She opened her pain-filled eyes and saw with horror how the Cupid statue fell from the broken baluster. The tip of Cupid's arrow, which bore the entire weight of the marble statue, pierced her left breast, pierced through and pinned her to the floor. Her body shook and her mouth fell open. The body relaxed and sightless eyes stared at the high tin ceiling. The wind sighed in the eaves, the fire crackled and died slowly, its heartbeat fading with the consumption of fuel until only smoldering coals remained. The house was quiet, the house was waiting. The owner, the Lord, will return soon. Revenge incarnate slumbered, having completed its task. Sylvia's moan was muffled by the pillow half covering her sleeping face. She had a very erotic dream. This was repeated, and the brightness consumed her, the pleasure she felt. The old house also fell into slumber. Occasionally, the creaking of logs was heard, long established, but disturbed by some kind of disturbance. Below, a few smoldering coals were reminiscent of fire and sensual scenes. John laid his beautiful wife down on the soft, fluffy carpet again and again, trying to get enough of her love to last him for the next 9 days. Sylvia was an extremely sensual woman, and he wanted her to remember, to be filled with the glow of his love, and to feel that they were not just husband and wife, but connected on a spiritual and romantic level, something he had never experienced with anyone before. Even with the deceiver whom he found lying at the foot of the stairs, Sylvia did remember. And in the evening she lit that fire again to remind herself of the man who filled her head, heart, and body with his love. She drank a glass of wine with dinner and took another to the chair she pulled up next to the fireplace. She placed an ottoman in front of the chair and, with her feet up, sipped a dark Cabernet. Her dogs stomped across the floor and dropped down next to her, groaning, their claws clicking on the wooden floor. She dozed off and felt that the atmosphere had become very tense. Interrupting her thoughts, she opened her eyes and looked around the room. Everything was okay. The walls, fixing their blind gaze on her, reassured her with their strength. The elk's head hanging over the fireplace, seemed to be looking at her approvingly. She relaxed, her eyes closed, and she fell back into slumber. Her thoughts were lost in a wine-dark sea of satisfaction, returning to the scene that had played out the night before. She felt a pleasant wave, remembering John's lips, remembering how he showered her breasts with his caresses. Sylvia had amazing, firm breasts. She felt the tickling of her long black curls falling into the cleavage revealed by the 3 buttons of her blouse that she had left undone. The dark creaminess of this curve welcomed the caress. She could almost feel the fiery lips pulling aside the curls of silky hair and leaving a hot trail down. The mind became absorbed in the vision of touch and sensation. It seemed to her that she was naked, light fingers playing along the satin of her skin, her husband's touches preparing her for pleasure. Desire overpowered all conscious thoughts as she gave in to her pleasure and exploded in the white light of pure passion, her cries echoing through the empty house until she fell exhausted, her mind empty. The fire that had been crackling busily, consuming its allotted fuel, spreading its warmth into the cold night air, died down, its flames dying down, until an orange glow filled the room with comfort. The dogs raised their heads, alarmed by the screams, but having calmed down, returned to their places. Sylvia stirred, her thoughts began to spin. Instinctively, her fingers slid down her body, and later she relaxed. It was a dream. Cupid smiled benevolently at her from his place on the balustrade, holding his arrow at the ready as she floated in the glow of her sleep. Lying in her large bed, she felt sleep take over her again. The morning sun barely broke through the lace panels on the window, and the boudoir was cozy and softly glowing. She stirred as the sensations from last night returned. It was John, his weight on her and in her. She felt his belly press against the curve of her ass. Sylvia knew that men liked to look at her ass. It was one of those round, bouncy things that starlets gravitated towards, and she worked very hard to keep it that way. Now she felt how her husband was immersed in enjoying her, just as she was enjoying him. A light breeze blew through the open window, parting the lace, and the beautiful morning sun looked down on the beautiful sleeping woman. She sank into oblivion and dozed off. An hour later, she got up, put on a light sundress, and went downstairs for breakfast. Her thoughts were in disarray. Strange dreams bothered her. She had had erotic dreams from time to time before, but she could never remember anything similar to the sensations she experienced. Never before had she experienced anything like this in these dreams, and never before had they seemed so startlingly real to her. There was just something about the atmosphere that seemed alive. It was hard to pinpoint what it was, but she always felt like there was something there, just beyond the senses, at the edge of her vision. At first she felt a little scared. Now it just seemed somewhat calming, like a kind angel was watching over her. She and John met in New York, and she quickly fell in love with his charm, soft Southern accent, and easy manner. It didn't hurt her that he had just taken over the department that most often affected her interests. They began dating, and by the time he had completed a major department overhaul, she knew he was the man for her. He told her about his home, and she imagined some kind of southern homestead overlooking acres of cotton fields. After 2 weeks without him, she felt very lonely, and his call inviting her to come and spend a week at his house was gladly accepted. The house was exactly as she had imagined it, except that instead of cotton fields, the tall windows looked out onto gardens filled with butterflies and hummingbirds fluttering among the immaculately tended flower beds. Majestic live oaks draped in Spanish moss lined the garden, and magnolias lined the driveway. They had been married for 2 months, but this was the first time John had to leave. She knew that she would miss him terribly, but the thought of his return and the joy that would fill their hearts made her anticipate and dream of a reunion. The ancient clock in the hallway rang, signaling that it was already 11 o'clock. She went out into the back garden and sat on the swing on the covered veranda, the dogs following her. The swing seemed to move on its own as she sipped her tea and breathed in the air, saturated with jasmine and lavender. Nearby were huge animals, bull mastiffs, and gifts from John, who knew that she longed for communication when he was not around. Did Mom's children find charming smells? She cooed to them as they circled around. They painted happily and sank onto the cool grass. The bay windows smiled at her. The house seemed pleased that its mistress was here. Ancient live oak logs were positioned comfortably. The years dragged on behind them. Memories walked, whispered, and creaked. It had once been a tree, a venerable forest giant, wreathed in tufts of Spanish moss. It towered above the swampy terrain, the slight elevation giving its view even greater extension. From time to time, people came, gathered at its foot, and performed their rituals. Sometimes they dug at its roots, burying their revered dead among beads, weapons, and offerings to the spirits. Over the years, a village of small hills grew around it, and the people changed. The tree itself became their most powerful talisman, the repository of their fortunes, and they offered prayers to its spirit. The tree did not remain ignorant. The prayers were slowly absorbed, and along with the movement of the juice came a movement of feelings. Enchantment filled the area, and over time the oak tree became aware of what was happening in the surrounding area. Then the visit stopped. People no longer came with their sadness and prayers. Not everything was good in their world, and they were expelled. The tree was waiting. His patience was limitless. Many centuries had passed, and barring a lightning strike or fire, he had many more centuries to think about. Over time, new people came. Others, and they did not express any thoughts. They weren't just visitors. They came to settle down. Their skin was pale, and their thoughts were about industry and agriculture. The forest was cleared, and the swamp was drained. Fields grew on the fertile soil, and the tree blessed them. They bore fruit in abundance, and the tree was satisfied. The final catastrophe has arrived, a fungus that attacks the roots of a giant. The fungus was slow and tiny, crawling through the soil, carried by bugs and crawling things. The foliage was depleted, the vitality dried up. The oak was forced to conserve its vitality more and more in order to survive. The battle was lost. This was not lost on Ethan Thomas. He came to this area, cleared fields, built a cabin, married his bride, raised children, and succeeded more than he could have imagined. The tree stood on his land. He admired the forest giant and was saddened by his decline. The plans that had been hatched in his head for a long time took shape. He will build his family their dream home, using lumber from a dying tree before it begins to decay and rot. The tree was cut down and the huge logs were taken away on a wagon to be cut into planks and flooring. The house took shape, built on the very hill that the tree occupied, and Ethan Thomas lived there the rest of his life, passing the house on to his son and subsequent generations. The spirit of the tree continued to live in the house. Generations of Thomas have been watched over by a watchful but invisible inhabitant. During the war, the loss of fortune and its restoration, during attacks by vagabonds and thugs, the house watched what was happening and took part in it. His current owner was among his favorites, just like his master. She reminded him of the dark-skinned people who surrounded the oak tree centuries ago, although her skin was a rich, creamy brown, while theirs had a different sheen. She was also in contact with the spirit world. Crystals on a gold chain adorned her neck. They were placed throughout the house, resting on mantles, shelves, and in cases. She performed rituals that were strange to her husband, but calmed him and the whole house. In her presence, the house gained strength, and the lawns and gardens abounded in a riot of colors and smells. In turn, the house looked after her, indulging the sensuality of her nature, caring for her and soothing her inner being. There are even snakes in Eden. In a small town nearby, there lived a snake. His name was Rodney Wilson. Because of his bad beginning, he was born into a rotten fruit. He was an inveterate laborer who did not seek work beyond his simple needs: food, alcohol, a shabby shack that he kept barely habitable. He used illegal substances. He was arrested many times. The county jail was often his residence. He once went to prison for molesting a neighbor's daughter. He was cautious, but sexually hungry. He accidentally learned of Sylvia's presence in this small community. He was sitting in the park when she passed by, walking her dogs. She amazed him and took his breath away. There weren't many people of color in the community, and that in itself was remarkable. But her hair, her huge mane of shiny curls, her face, exotic and mysterious, her body, the firmness of it demonstrated by her sports top and shorts, the way her hips swayed. He was hypnotized. He often saw her in the city, and she followed him. Watching her became an obsession. He talked to her several times, and her friendly and open manner attracted him even more. He was also offended by the fact that in subsequent meetings, she never remembered him. The aftermath of the hurricane found Rodney at work, cleaning up the countryside. John and Sylvia, of course, hired workers to clean up their property. Rodney wasn't lucky enough to be one of the men hired, but he was working on a neighbor's property and saw her in the yard, her yellow sundress a splash of color against the green lawns. Once the work was completed, Rodney had some money and bought the drug he needed, which should last him for a while if he was careful. He joined a small group of his brethren at the river, not far from where John and Sylvia's property was located. When the party ended, Rodney got into his old truck and drove down the highway towards the city. As he drove by, he noticed that one light was on in John and Sylvia's house. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and stopped. He sat for a while, driven by hunger, but restrained by caution. Hunger won, and he crept along the path to the house. As unfamiliar feet stepped onto the driveway and towards the carefully manicured lawn, the reality of the intruder slowly began to form. The reflections from the pool sparkled menacingly, and the stranger felt a vague uneasiness overcome him. He thought about leaving, but the spot of light from that window, flickering strangely, attracted him like a moth to a flame. Carefully looking inside, he saw that it was a large bathroom with a tiled floor, a dressing table on which bottles of cosmetics stood. There was a candle burning on the dressing table, and two more flickered on the edge of the huge bathtub. Sylvia was enjoying her bath. She left John in bed, after turning him into a trembling wreck, and filled the bath. Bubbles rose as she entered, and a stream flowed down. The candles filled the room with a scent she loved, and she relaxed, taking a long soak. She had a glass of her favorite red wine, and a half-empty bottle stood next to it. She soaked, finishing off the wine and letting the silence of the house lull her into a slumber. The water began to cool, and she stepped out of the bath, drying herself off with a large fluffy towel. Rodney, standing outside the window, froze in his tracks. The naked beauty of this goddess was the subject of his dreams. He stood, fascinated, watching her as she finally wrapped a towel around herself, hiding her exposed beauty from prying eyes. She spent a lot of time taking out various bottles and jars, combing her hair with them until it formed those shiny curls that framed her face in that familiar way. She blew out the two candles on the bathtub, collected her empty glass and bottle, and, taking the lighted candle from the mantelpiece, left the room. Rodney followed the flickering light through the house and finally reached the kitchen, where Sylvia turned on the light over the sink and blew out the candle. She lazily rinsed the glass in the sink, put it in the dishwasher, and turned it on. The inrush current caused a failure in the safety system. The alarm went off, fluting the wall of the house with light, illuminating the man lurking outside. Noticing the flash of light, Sylvia looked towards the window. There, in the light, framed by the kitchen window, Rodney's face could be seen. She froze for a brief moment, shocked into immobility. A quiet scream escaped her lips, and she ran away. Rodney wasted no time in running away down the long driveway. Sylvia ran into the bedroom and shook her sleeping husband. "John, wake up!" She shook it again, running over to grab the robes. "Someone was looking in the kitchen window," she whispered. "Get up. Let's see if they're still there." John stumbled to his feet, threw on his robe, and followed her to the front door, stopping only to grab a 12-gauge pistol from behind the bedroom door. "Are you sure, honey? Did you really see someone?" "Yes, there was a man there." She was categorical. "I will never forget this face. He seemed a little familiar to me, as if I had seen him before. As they approached the door, Niles and Grant became alarmed at the alarm they felt and joined their hosts. John opened the door, chambered a cartridge, and took aim. Niles and Grant ran out onto the porch looking for the source of what was bothering Sylvia. Near the end of the driveway, as they hurried through the magnolia trees, they saw a stalking figure trying to hide. With a roar, the dogs took off, two huge figures rushing down the driveway after the fleeing intruder. He cast a frightened glance over his shoulder and began to run even faster. John turned on the outside lights. The driveway flooded with light, and they watched the chase. Rodney made it to his pickup truck and jumped in, just before slamming the door. The truck sped off into the night, its gray door glinting in the moonlight. The consequences of this shocked Sylvia. She was not afraid of anyone, but at night she felt uneasy, especially in the kitchen. John understood her concerns and did everything he could. He installed motion-sensing alarms, updated the alarm system, and installed security bolts on all doors and windows. This really comforted Sylvia, but she still had a feeling of fear. A month passed, and although her anxiety had subsided, it was always there in the back of her mind. When she was at home, the aura of peace gradually calmed, but it seemed that when she went out, her thoughts were disturbed, and it took some time for her serenity to return once she was in her cocoon of safety. On Friday, Sylvia decided to go visit a couple of elderly friends. She went into a bakery and chose a dozen different donuts, an apple pie, and 3 cups of coffee. On the way to the car, she had a hard time carrying everything neatly, but she managed to open the door, put a box of donuts and a pie on the passenger seat, and 2 cups of coffee in the cup holders. She opened the back door, lowered the armrest to access the 3rd cup holder, and straightened up to get into the driver's seat and drive away. Rodney Wilson hasn't forgotten Sylvia. On the contrary, his obsession increased. After he saw her naked, emerging from the bathtub like Aphrodite emerging from the foam, her image filled his mind. His innate caution kept him from returning, and he was terrified of dogs. Instead, he wandered along the main street of the city, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. They saw each other less often than he had hoped, since she had become effectively a recluse. But he did see her with her husband at the grocery store and at the post office. He walked nearby, always keeping in the background, remaining a vague figure in the shadows, but his hunger fed on her beauty from a distance. He was buying gas at a convenience store when he saw her. She was driving her yellow Charger. He thought yellow must be her favorite color, and her car was yellow. She was wearing a yellow coat, and it was the sexiest picture he had ever seen, her in a yellow coat, a little black dress and heels. He jumped into his truck, following Sylvia. She drove into a candy store, and he parked on the other side of the street, watching her. She walked out, and he watched as she put her shopping in her car. He parked nearby, admiring the curve of her yoga pants-clad ass as her top rode up. She straightened up, and he walked out, intending to walk past her into the store. Sylvia heard the sound of a car approaching behind her. She stood up and turned around. What she saw made her freeze in place for a moment. It was a blue truck, with 1 gray door. Her gaze darted to the passenger, and she saw his face. It was etched in her memory, in the kitchen window, echoing hauntingly through her mind. Terror filled her for a moment, but was quickly replaced by white-hot rage. It was the face that made her unhappy. It was the man who invaded her privacy, instilling fear in her own home, suppressing her sense of comfort, and driving her crazy. She took 2 steps towards Rodney Wilson, her first landing a brutal blow to the liver. Sylvia was a strong woman. At almost 6 feet tall and 140 pounds of thick muscle, she was an athlete. She lifted weights 4 days a week and worked on her fighting skills by punching and kicking bags 3 days a week. She wanted to look good for her husband and trained for it. Before meeting John, she often spared at the gym, fighting both men and women in kickboxing and mixed martial arts matches. The fist struck Rodney, just below his diaphragm and above his stomach. The blow was delivered with all her explosive fury, even to the point of rage. The left hook, delivered with all his might, landed under Rodney's ribs and went up to the base of his shoulder blade. Sylvia's fist sank deep into his soft body. The air left his body with an explosion, and excruciating pain filled his mind with a red mist. The left hand was followed by a right hand to the same area, and he fell to his knees, bending over in pain. As he fell, his face was met with a powerful blow from Sylvia's right knee, breaking his nose and spattering blood on the asphalt. He lay there in a fog of pain and felt a new pain when he was grabbed by the hair, his head was raised, and the face of a vengeful goddess appeared before his blurred vision. "Remember me, bastard!" the goddess screamed in his face. "Come back to my house and I will finish you off and feed you to the dogs. Can you hear me?" Rodney did his best to show that he understood perfectly. His head hit the asphalt and he heard a car door slam. There was a roar of exhaust gases and he heard a car speeding away. He fought through the agony, managing to crawl to his truck and climb inside. His nose was bleeding profusely and he found paper towels to stop the bleeding. He managed to get home, where he lost consciousness. Both his eyes turned black and his nose became crooked. His health wasn't the only thing he cared about. Alcohol and illegal substances fueled a rage that, combined with his obsession, left him unable to rest. Fury mingled with memories of her naked glory. Obsession became compulsion, and as his body healed, his hunger grew. On the 5th night of John's absence, Sylvia made herself dinner, a delicious salad with fresh berries, and took it into the living room to curl up with a book, Niles and Grant snoring on the floor next to her. She was very engrossed in her book, the murder mystery in the first chapter, and the lack of evidence of the killer up until this point. She lit a fire, and it crackled happily in the fireplace. Completely immersed in the story, she was brought out of her reverie by the shrill sound of the alarm when the security system detected the back door being broken into. She jumped to her feet, called Niles and Grant, and ran to her bedroom. She slammed the door, locked it, and grabbing the shotgun, retreated to the bathroom and chambered around. Niles and Grant, sensing her fear, wandered around the bedroom, grumbling displeased. Entering the hallway through the broken back door, Rodney Wilson took the time to check the layout of the house. As he walked through the living room, he noticed a burning fireplace, indicating that Sylvia was home. The eyes of the moose head above the fireplace sparkled with obsidian malice, and Rodney shivered under that gaze. The fire crackled angrily, making him flinch, and it seemed to him that the statue of Cupid at the foot of the stairs was aiming its arrow straight at Rodney's heart. His nerves, never known for balance, were on a razor's edge. He walked through the house, its open layout allowing him to quickly determine that Sylvia must either be behind one of the 3 closed doors or upstairs. An obsession took hold of him, and he opened the closed door leading from the kitchen. A storeroom appeared before his eyes, and he entered it, looking for something hidden. The thought flashed through his fevered brain that Sylvia might be in the dark room. The floor creaked ominously and continuously in his ears as he moved. As he walked past a tall wine rack, dark bottles filling every corner, something moved and the door slammed behind him. Turning, he rushed towards the door and hit his shoulder on the counter. The bottle fell, breaking on the tiled floor, wine splattering on his feet and the floor. He slipped and crashed into the counter, falling to his knees. He looked up in helpless horror. The heavy counter, laden with hundreds of bottles of liquid, leaned dangerously forward. He screamed hoarsely as the counter toppled over, pinning him to the floor, and 2 bottles of Cabernet shattered and pierced his chest with their jagged necks. Pinned down by the heavy stand, with blood gushing from his chest, Rodney struggled for a short time and fell silent. Silence filled the house. The logs returned to their usual configuration. The fire crackled joyfully again, and the elk's gaze smiled benevolently in the empty room. When John returned the next morning, he saw the alarm flashing. He turned it off and went to look for his wife. The bedroom door was locked. John had the keys and opened the door. Sylvia sat on the bed, shotgun in her lap. Her eyes closed in exhaustion from the night's vigil. Niles and Grant rose from the floor on either side of the bed and rubbed themselves affectionately against his legs. He knelt down and hugged them, scratching them behind the ears and making them snore in ecstasy. After greeting his wife's furry guards, he walked over to the bed, sat down next to her, and pulled her into a tight embrace. She woke up from her sleep, trying to pick up the shotgun, but he held her tightly, whispering strong words of comfort and love into her ear. "Were you waiting to shoot me, kitten?" His gentle joke brought her to her senses, and she clung to him, sobbing in his cozy embrace. "John, it was terrible." She put the shotgun aside and fell into his arms. Someone broke in." The alarm went off. "I was so afraid." "Shh." He wiped away her tears with kisses. "Everything is fine. I called the sheriff and he's on his way. We'll just wait until he arrives." They heard sirens in the distance. The house watched them. Its peaceful atmosphere gave comfort and tranquility. For a moment, he became something more than just an observer. He became a participant, showed his abilities, and turned out to be quite strong. No one will ever again harm those under his protection.